The stink of the city hit harder at 6 a.m. than any reality Calvin Desmond Freeman had faced in the last 3 decades. Rotten coffee, gasoline, piss on warm concrete, the scent of broken promises. He sat on a slab of sidewalk near Hope Bridge Shelter, hoodie drawn tight, jeans dirty by design, a billionaire wrapped in synthetic poverty. The concrete was cold under him, not cold enough to numb, just enough to humiliate. A young man stepped over him, gave a quick glance, and kept walking. Another shook his head in disgust. Calvin hadn't been invisible in years. He was always Mr. Freeman, always the keynote speaker, the headline, the honored guest. But now he was just another black man on the edge of South Central LA, sitting cross-legged beside a trash bin, ignored. Just like he used to be. A middle-aged white woman walked by with her dog. She pulled the leash tighter as she passed, eyes front, body stiff. Calvin lowered his head and whispered, "Morning to you too, Miss America." "You got a problem?" she snapped, turning back for a moment. "No, ma'am," he said. "Just admiring the dog." She rolled her eyes. "Get a job." He smiled bitterly. He had 77,000 employees, but right now she was right. He looked like a man who had nothing. A paper cup clinked to the sidewalk next to him. Quarters, dimes, a $1 bill. A man wearing a neon orange vest squatted beside him. "You knew?" the man asked. Calvin hesitated. "Just passing through." "You'll want to get to the soup line by 8. Thursdays they run out early." The man eyed him, curious. "What's your name?" Calvin looked down at his sneakers. Cheap, tattered, bought from a thrift store in Pasadena for $6. Ray Matthews." "Nice to meet you, Ray. I'm Otis. Stay out of trouble, man." Calvin nodded. Otis walked off, whistling an old Sam Cooke tune. He looked around. The morning was sharpening. More people trickled in, men dragging black, plastic bags, women pushing carts filled with blankets and fast food wrappers, young kids bouncing rocks between cracks in the pavement. Calvin watched them all, watched how invisible they were. "Ray, huh?" The voice came from behind him. Young, steady, curious. Calvin turned his head and met the eyes of Jalen Christopher Carter. He stood tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing faded jeans, a blue Carhartt jacket with a missing zipper, and worn sneakers that had seen too many shifts. There was grease on his hands, a duffel bag on his shoulder, sharp jaw, kind eyes. Eyes that carried something Calvin couldn't place. Not yet. "Yeah," Calvin said. "Ray." Jalen tilted his head. "I've seen you out here the last 2 days. You always sit alone. Not much of a people person." Jalen chuckled. "You better learn. This sidewalk's got politics, man. Seating order, conversation flow, who gets first crack at leftovers from Tony's taco truck." He pointed down, the block. "That spot's gold after 10 p.m. Noted." Jalen sat beside him without asking. Calvin felt the shift in air. This boy didn't carry the heaviness most people here did. He was grounded, present, and his posture wasn't slumped. His back was straight. "You stay at Hope Bridge?" "Not yet. Thinking about it." Jalen nodded. "You should. It's not perfect, but Miss Carla runs the place like a drill sergeant. Keeps the creeps out." A silence settled between them. Calvin studied him subtly. The way Jalen's fingers twitched slightly, like they were used to being busy, like his mind was always processing something even when his mouth was quiet. "You from around here?" Calvin asked. Jalen hesitated. "Nah. Grew up bouncing between group homes, all over LA. Been on my own since I was 16. And now? 2 jobs. Wash cars during the day, clean office buildings at night, saving up. For what?" Jalen smiled, sheepish. "Startup." Calvin blinked. "Come again?" "I'm building a prototype. AI-based logistics manager. Small businesses waste time trying to figure out deliveries, storage, routes. I want to streamline that." There was a pause. Calvin cleared his throat. "Sounds ambitious." Jalen shrugged. "I'm not asking for a miracle, just time. A shot." Calvin looked away toward the horizon. The sun was climbing, making the glass towers of downtown shimmer like false promises. How many men like Jalen had he walked past over the years? How many ideas were buried in cardboard shelters and bus station benches? You believe in what you're building? Calvin asked. Every damn day. That's good, Calvin said. Keep building. Jalen raised an eyebrow. You don't talk like most people here. Calvin smirked. Maybe I'm not like most people here. Yeah, Jalen said, standing. I figured. No offense, but you got the shoes all wrong. Calvin looked down. Those are resale Adidas from last season, Jalen said. Homeless folks don't rock collector's items, even scuffed. Calvin opened his mouth, but no words came. Jalen grinned. Relax, man. I won't tell. Everyone's hiding something. With that, he walked off, disappearing into the bustle. Calvin exhaled slowly. His pulse was racing. Everyone's hiding something. He stood up and dusted himself off. Across the street, a teenage girl was yelling at a city worker who'd tossed her blanket in a trash bin. 2 officers approached. The girl screamed louder. The older man in the vest, Otis, intervened. Calvin watched as the chaos unfolded. This was the world he'd left behind. But now, it was where he felt most alive. He walked toward the shelter entrance. Jalen's words still echoed. Everyone's hiding something, including you, Ray. The days blurred together on the streets of South Central. Dust, diesel fumes, the scrape of shopping carts over concrete. Calvin kept his head low, but his eyes were always moving, observing, listening, picking up patterns. Hope Bridge Shelter became a kind of rhythm for him. You woke up before the light claimed your place in line. You spoke softly if you were smart. You didn't ask questions unless you were ready for answers you might not like. Calvin Ray now ate bad oatmeal every morning and swept the shelter courtyard as volunteer duty. His beard grew uneven. His back ached. But every step he took away from Freeman Tech was a step closer to something real, something honest. And then there was Jalen. Every night after finishing his janitor shift, Jalen would sit outside Hope Bridge with a thermos of instant coffee and a cheap tablet with a cracked screen. Sometimes he typed code. Sometimes he just stared into the sky like it might offer him a roadmap. Calvin started sitting with him more. They didn't talk much at first, but slowly, the silences softened. One night, Jalen passed Calvin the thermos. Tastes like gasoline, but it keeps me awake. Calvin took a sip, grimaced. You sure this isn't antifreeze? Jalen laughed. I've survived worse. They sat side by side on the concrete stoop, steam rising in the cold. Calvin leaned back. You ever thought about pitching that startup of yours to investors? He asked. Jalen gave a tired smile. They don't really take meetings in alleys. Maybe not, but ideas speak louder than zip codes. Jalen turned his head. You talk like someone who's been in boardrooms. I read a lot, Calvin lied, then looked away. Before all this, Jalen accepted the vague response. Well, I wrote a pitch deck once, had it on my old laptop, got stolen 3 months ago, along with my resume, portfolio. Only thing they didn't take was this. He pulled out something from his pocket, a small rusted pendant on a broken chain. Calvin's eyes narrowed. What's that? Jalen held it out. No idea. Found it in my stuff after I aged out of the system. Social workers said it was all they had from when I was dropped off as a baby. Calvin took it carefully, turning the metal over. The initials, CF. His breath hitched. CF, he said aloud. Jalen nodded. I keep it like a charm. Some days I think it's just junk. Other days, he shrugged. Feels like it meant something once. Calvin forced his voice to stay steady. It probably did. He returned it. Jalen tucked it back into his jacket, unaware of the storm it had stirred. That night, Calvin couldn't sleep. He lay on the cot in the men's dormitory, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. His mind spiraled. Could it be? After all these years? He rose before dawn, stepped outside, and made a call from a burner phone hidden beneath a loose brick near the shelter's rear gate. Sasha, he whispered. Her voice came sharp and alert. Mr. Freeman? Jesus, are you okay? Fine. Listen to me carefully. I need a full background check on a man named Jalen Christopher Carter, age 24, African American. Grew up in the foster system in LA. No parents listed. Find everything. You think he's... I don't know what to think. Just do it. Quietly. She paused. You're getting in deep. I was born deep. Now I'm just going home. 3 days passed. Calvin kept up the charade. Jalen noticed he was quieter but didn't press. Then one night, Sasha's text came through. Received. Results within 48 HRs. Also, we have a lead. Woman, named Carla knows something. Calvin didn't reply. He just stared at the screen until it dimmed. The next day at breakfast, Calvin waited until Jalen finished shoveling eggs into his mouth. The food was barely edible, but Jalen always made it look like he hadn't eaten in days. You ever ask about your parents? Calvin asked, trying to sound casual. Jalen wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Sure, as a kid. You learn to stop eventually. No one ever had answers. I got bounced between so many homes they stopped trying. You never got curious about the pendant? The initials? Jalen leaned back, thoughtful. Once I tried to run a search on public records. There's like 1,000 C. Freemans in the system. Some dead, some locked up, some just disappeared. He gave a short laugh. If I'm being honest, I think it's better not to know. That way I don't have to blame anybody. Calvin felt that line like a blade between the ribs. You think if you met them, your real parents, you'd forgive them? Jalen was quiet for a long time. He tapped the side of his thermos. I don't know. Depends why they left. Depends who they became. Calvin nodded. Fair. Later that afternoon, Miss Carla called Jalen to the back office. Calvin watched from a distance. Jalen emerged. 20 minutes later, face unreadable, eyes low. They sat together outside again that night, but Jalen was different. He wasn't coding. He wasn't sipping from his thermos. He was just... still. She told me I was left here, on the steps, wrapped in a towel. Jalen said quietly. No note. No name. Just that damn pendant. No one ever came for me. Calvin swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Jalen looked at him. You don't have to be. You didn't leave me. There. But Calvin said nothing. He just looked down. Jalen exhaled and stood. I'm gonna crash early. Double shift tomorrow. Calvin watched him walk inside. He waited until the door closed, then turned toward the darkness of the alley and dialed Sasha. What did the report say? Her voice came through, tight with disbelief. Jalen Carter, born March 7, 2001. No hospital record. No birth certificate, but DNA markers. Calvin's heart pounded. They match. Calvin, it's a 99.99% paternal match. He's your son. The silence swallowed him. Sir? Sasha asked softly. Calvin's voice cracked. Thank you. He ended the call and leaned against the wall, the alley spinning around him. He had found his son, but now came the hardest part. How do you tell someone who never had a family that you're the one who lost him? Rain began to fall in the early hours of the morning. Cold, fine, and relentless. The kind of rain Los Angeles rarely saw, like the city itself was finally cracking open. Calvin stood across the street from Hope Bridge, soaked to the skin, watching. The windows flicker with light as the shelter woke up. He hadn't slept, not really. The confirmation from Sasha replayed in his head like a looped recording. Jalen is your son. Not maybe. Not probably. Is. And still it didn't feel real, not in the way he expected. There was no swelling music, no moment of clarity. Just fear. Raw, suffocating fear. He'd found his son. But what if his son didn't want to be found? Inside the shelter. Jalen moved through the kitchen, helping serve breakfast even though he wasn't on shift. He kept his head down, tired, and for the first time since Calvin had met him, quiet. Miss Carla watched him closely from the doorway, then looked over at Calvin as he walked in, his hood dripping on the tile floor. He didn't sleep last night, she whispered. Calvin wiped his hands on his jeans. Did he say anything? She hesitated. He's unraveling, Ray. That pendant's got him thinking things best left alone. I disagree. She narrowed her eyes. Don't play with that boy's mind. He's been through more than you can guess. Calvin looked her straight in the eye. I'm not playing. I'm trying to make something right. Miss Carla studied him for a long beat, then sighed. You better be sure. If you break that boy's heart, it'll be the last thing I let you do. That afternoon, Jalen didn't show up to wash cars. Calvin waited by the lot gate for 2 hours until Rico, the manager, shrugged and said, Kid texted, said he needed time. Something was shifting. Calvin felt it like a tremor beneath the asphalt. That night, Jalen didn't come to the shelter either. By the next morning, Sasha had sent a second report. There's more. The woman who had your child. Her name was Teresa Carter. She died in 2001 during labor. No known relatives. The baby was listed as abandoned at birth. Calvin sat on a milk crate in the alley behind the shelter, hands trembling. He'd spent years hating her, blaming her for what happened. But she'd died trying to bring his son into the world, alone. In silence, he wanted to scream, but there were no words big enough. It was dusk when Jalen appeared again, standing in front of the shelter, rain dripping from the edge of his jacket. Calvin stepped out slowly. You disappeared, he said. Jalen didn't move. I needed space. Did you find what you were looking for? Jalen shrugged. Not really, just more questions. They stood there in silence as the city buzzed around them. The rain had eased to a mist. Calvin stepped forward. I need to tell you something, and I need you to really listen. Jalen looked at him. Okay. I didn't come here by accident, Calvin said. I've been looking for someone, for a long time. Jalen's eyes flickered. Who? Calvin hesitated. Then, my son. Jalen didn't speak. He just stared. I was 18 when he was taken from me, Calvin continued. I didn't have money. I didn't have power. I signed away my rights because I was scared and stupid, and I thought I'd never see him again. Jalen's breath caught. Why are you telling me this? Because I found him, Calvin said, his voice cracked. And it's you? The street went quiet in Jalen's ears. The words didn't land. Or maybe they landed too hard. What the hell are you talking about? He whispered. I had your DNA tested, Calvin admitted. I had to know. The pendant, the timing, your face, I had to. Jalen took a step back. You tested me without asking? I know how that sounds, but no, Jalen said sharply. You don't. You don't know how any of this sounds because you're not the one who's been alone his whole life. Clinging to a piece of scrap metal like it meant something, Calvin stepped closer. It does mean something. It means I never stopped looking for you. Jalen shook his head. You didn't even know I was alive. I didn't. But the second I thought it might be you, I didn't stop. Jalen turned, away, hands on his head, pacing like a man trying not to explode. You think this fixes anything? He asked. You show up here with your money and your history and your guilt and expect me to what? Hug you? No, Calvin said quietly. I don't expect anything, but I needed you to know the truth. Jalen's voice dropped. What if I don't want it? Calvin stepped back. Then I'll disappear. I swear it. But not without saying this. I didn't choose to leave you. I lost you. And if you'll let me, I want to know you. Not as a charity case. Not as a project. As my son. The word hung in the air like thunder. Jalen didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing hard, then turned and walked down the street without another word. Calvin didn't follow. He stood alone in the rain again, just as he had at the beginning. 2 days passed. Calvin went back to the sidewalk. No sign of Jalen. He called Sasha. No news. Then, on the third night, as he was sitting alone behind the shelter, Jalen appeared in the alley. He looked tired, wet, but calmer. You lied to me, Jalen said. I did. You stalked me. I did that too. Jalen walked closer. You humiliated me. Calvin nodded. I deserve that. Jalen pulled something from his pocket and held it out. The pendant. I don't know what this meant before, he said. But I think I know what it means now. Calvin stared at it, his heart breaking wide open. Jalen held it out, and for the first time, placed it into Calvin's hand. You better not fuck this up, he said. Calvin laughed, tears in his eyes. I won't. Jalen stepped back and with a small, almost imperceptible nod said, I'm not calling you Dad. Fair enough. They stood in silence, not needing anything else. The past couldn't be erased, but maybe, just maybe, the future could be written by their own hands. It started small. Jalen came by the shelter less, not because he was avoiding Calvin, but because they had quietly started meeting elsewhere. At first it was coffee in cheap diners, late-night walks through the empty parking lots behind strip malls. Then Calvin got them a small workspace. A garage in Inglewood with busted windows, a leaky roof, and an old drafting table that Jalen cleaned like it was sacred. You sure you don't want to upgrade? Calvin asked one day, handing him a box of old wires and processors. Jalen grinned. Nah. If the idea's good enough, it doesn't need marble floors. Calvin chuckled. That's not how venture capitalists think. Jalen looked at him serious. That's why I'm not one. They fell into a rhythm. Not quite father and son, not quite friends, something between survival and rebuilding. Calvin started showing up at Jalen's night shifts, quietly mopping, alongside him. Jalen didn't question it anymore. You know, Jalen said once, people think I'm crazy for trusting you. Calvin glanced over. They're probably right. But I've been lied to by worse. And at least you admit your lies. That quiet honesty became the cornerstone of their connection. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Sasha was working overtime. She booked lawyers, silent ones. She helped Calvin update his will, quietly moving Jalen into it, but without making any public announcement. You sure you want to do this? She asked one afternoon in his Bel Air study. Calvin was still dressing in old clothes, refusing to return fully to his public image. I missed 24 years, he said. I won't miss the next 24. Sasha hesitated. There's something else. She placed a file on the desk. I had the lab rerun the DNA test just to be sure. Calvin froze. Why? Because something didn't sit right. The chain of custody on the sample was off. He opened the file, and there, it was test inconclusive, contamination suspected, new test recommended. His blood ran cold. The next day, while Jalen soldered a circuit board under a buzzing lamp, Calvin stood across from him, hands in his jacket. I have to tell you something, he said. Jalen looked up. Sounds familiar? Calvin exhaled. We reran the DNA test. Jalen stopped. What do you mean? The first one may have been compromised. Sasha found inconsistencies, so we did it again. Jalen stared at him. And? Calvin struggled. It came back inconclusive. We don't know. Jalen stood slowly. So, what? I might not be your son after all? I don't know. Jalen's face went blank. And you waited how long to tell me this? I only found out yesterday. Jalen walked away from the table, pacing the garage. Jesus, man, what the hell are we doing here? I don't know, Calvin said, but I meant everything I said before. You changed my life. Whether we're blood or not, that doesn't change. Jalen stopped. It changes everything. No, Calvin said, stepping forward. It doesn't. You think I showed up in that shelter because I knew who you were? I didn't. I stayed because of who you are, because of how you carry pain with grace, because you remind me of the man I wanted to be. Jalen didn't speak. Calvin pressed on. If you want out, if you want me gone, I'll go. But this thing we've started, it's real. Maybe not by blood, but it's real. Jalen looked down. I don't know if I can believe you again. Calvin nodded. Then don't. Just believe in yourself, that's all I ever wanted to do. A week passed. Jalen didn't call. Calvin didn't push. Sasha kept her distance too, sensing the fracture. But she forwarded one last piece of information. From the investigation, Teresa Carter's labor had complications. There was a second baby. A stillbirth was reported. The living child had no formal ID. But hospital staff remembered something. A necklace. With initials. It wasn't proof, but it was something. Calvin read the file 10 times. He wanted it to mean something definitive, but it didn't. So he stopped chasing truth and started chasing meaning. On the second Sunday of the month, Jalen showed up to the garage. No warning, no call. He opened the door, saw Calvin sitting at the table with 2 mugs of coffee. "I thought about what you said," Jalen said. Calvin didn't move. "And?" Jalen exhaled. "I don't know who my father is, but I know what a father acts like. And for the last month, that's been you." Calvin said nothing. Just let the words wash over him. Jalen stepped in. "So, let's build something. Maybe it'll be a company. Maybe it'll be something else." He reached out and pushed a laptop toward Calvin. "I want to call it the Carter-Freeman Initiative." Calvin blinked. "You sure?" Jalen nodded. "You gave me your name. I'm giving it back. But this time, we do it together." Calvin stood up slowly. "Then let's make something that lasts, longer than both of us." The announcement came 1 month later. A press conference. Flashbulbs. Cameras. The world knew Calvin Freeman. But it didn't know Ray Matthews. It didn't know the version of him that slept on sidewalks, wiped floors beside a boy named Jalen, or wept over a necklace in a dimly lit garage. Now it would. Calvin stepped to the podium. "Before I speak, as a businessman, let me speak as a man. For most of my life, I built things to feel in control. I built a company, a reputation, a wall around myself." He looked at Jalen, who stood just behind the curtain watching. "But none of that compares to what I found in a shelter on the south side of Los Angeles. I found a young man who reminded me who I really was." He paused. "And whether by blood or bond, he's my family." He turned and nodded. Jalen stepped onto the stage, and together, they announced a $500 million fund dedicated to giving young, marginalized entrepreneurs access to capital, mentorship, and protection from the kind of silence that had stolen years from both of them. The crowd erupted, but neither of them smiled for the cameras, because they weren't performing. They were beginning. The air in San Francisco was crisper than usual that evening, the kind of late spring chill that made you pull your jacket closer, but didn't quite justify a scarf. Calvin stood on the rooftop terrace of the Carter-Freeman Foundation's new headquarters. Glass panels and clean steel edges overlooking a city built on invention and inequality. Inside, a gala buzzed. Lights, applause. Donors sipping champagne and pretending not to measure each other's net worth. But out here, above the noise, he could breathe. Behind him, the rooftop door creaked open. Jalen stepped out. No tuxedo. Just a navy sweater and black slacks. His curls were neater than usual, and he wore a pair of clean white sneakers that Calvin had learned were far more expensive than they looked. "Don't like crowds either, huh?" Jalen asked, leaning beside him on the railing. Calvin smiled. "I used to. Now they just feel like people waiting for the next headline." Jalen nodded. "They're not here for us, they're here for what we represent." "Which is?" Jalen paused. "Possibility. Maybe redemption. Maybe guilt money." Calvin laughed. "You've grown cynical." "I've grown up." They stood in silence for a moment, the city glittering below them. "You know," Jalen said slowly, "there was a time I'd have given anything to know where I came from. Now I think the not knowing made me who I am." Calvin looked over. "You don't want to try again? Another test?" Jalen shook his head. "If it comes one day, okay, but I don't need science to tell me who's shown up for me." Calvin's throat tightened. Thank you for not giving up when I walked away, Jalen added. You had every right to, Calvin said. I earned that. Yeah. But so did I, and you didn't let me drown in it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pendant. It had been cleaned, polished, placed on a new chain. The initials still barely visible. I've been thinking, Jalen said. Maybe it doesn't stand for C. Freeman. Maybe it's something else. Like what? Like choice found. Calvin blinked. I didn't get a say in how I came into this world, but I get to choose how I stay in it, Jalen continued. And who I stay in it with. He placed the pendant in Calvin's hand. Calvin stared at it, then put it around his neck. No flashbulbs, no witnesses, just two men under a cold sky, rewriting what legacy meant. 6 months later, the Carter Freeman Initiative opened its first hub in Watts, Los Angeles. Not downtown, not Silicon Valley. Watts, Jalen insisted. He taught coding workshops to teenagers who'd never touched a laptop. Calvin met with single mothers trying to launch catering businesses, janitors with side hustles in app development, foster kids learning to build their first websites. You changed everything, one of them told Calvin, but he shook his head. No, he did. He pointed to Jalen across the room, laughing with two teenagers who were showing him a prototype made of cardboard and tape. That night, Calvin visited Compton for the first time in 20 years. He found the alley behind the halfway house he once slept in back when he was just a boy with dreams too loud for the streets to ignore. He sat on the curb remembering Teresa, her voice, her laughter, the way she'd once put her hand on his chest and said, "You're not gonna stay down here forever, Cal, but don't forget what the air feels like at the bottom." He hadn't forgotten. Now, neither would his son. On the anniversary of the foundation's launch, Jalen gave the closing remarks at a panel in New York. He stood in front of a crowd of journalists, tech moguls, and teenagers with clipboards. Name is Jalen Christopher Carter, he said, voice steady. I don't know my full origin story, I probably never will, but I know what I'm building now. Not just an app or a company, but a future. One where people like me don't have to win a genetic lottery to be seen. He paused, and when I met a man who mistook me for his son, I got angry. I pushed back. But what I learned is that sometimes the family that chooses you, this means more than the one you're born to. The audience stood in silence. Not applause, not noise. Respect. Back in Los Angeles, in the garage where it all began, Calvin sat at the workbench. The place was cleaner now, brighter, but he kept one corner untouched, the cracked lamp, the old stool, the first blueprint Jalen had ever drawn taped to the wall like a sacred artifact. Jalen walked in, holding 2 coffees. You still drink this garbage? Calvin asked. Jalen grinned. Tradition. They sat side by side in the quiet. I never told you what I'd planned to name my son, Calvin said suddenly. Jalen looked over. No? Calvin shook his head. Christopher. Jalen blinked. You're messing with me. I'm not. Teresa picked it, after her grandfather. Jalen didn't speak for a moment. Then he leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said, Maybe some things find their way back to you anyway. That night, before locking up the garage, Calvin passed Jalen. A folder, what's this? Jalen asked. My resignation letter. Jalen opened it, confused. Inside was a single page. To whom it may concern, I'm done chasing empires. I'm building people now. At the bottom, Calvin had scrawled, Legacy is not what you leave. It's who you raise. Jalen looked up. I guess that makes me CEO. Damn right it does, Calvin said, smiling. Jalen extended his hand. Calvin didn't hesitate. They shook. Firm, steady. Not as strangers, not as billionaire and mentee, but as something far more enduring.